Good morning, everyone. My name, again, is Mark Sylvia. I'm the Managing Director for People and Civic Engagement here at BlueWave, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar this morning, SREC to Smart. This next slide gives you a bio for me and for our presenter, Mike Judge, who I will introduce in a few minutes. So I don't want to spend any more time talking about me, but certainly I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about Mike, which we'll be doing momentarily. I also wanted to mention that we're really excited as a company to be providing you with this webinar today. BlueWave has been very engaged in the process of developing the SMART regulations. We had the opportunity to serve on numerous working groups, participating by submitting comments, and being actively engaged with the Department of Energy Resources and other agencies responsible for implementation of SMART. This is just another service that we're providing to our partners as we move towards the implementation of the SMART program. Our mission as a company is to revolutionize energy with simple, powerful solar solutions. Our vision is to transform access to clean energy, and we live that every day. And a reflection of that is our being a certified B Corporation. In terms of what we do, we have three very focused and innovative products that we provide to our customers and partners. We provide community solar services, consumer loans financing, and solar project development. At this point, I'd like to now introduce our presenter for today, Mike Judge. Mike is the Director of the Renewable and Alternative Energy Development Division at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. Mike has been a real leader in progressing renewable energy in Massachusetts. He's had a very successful career at DOER in multiple capacities, now as the director. Prior to his time at DOER, he was at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We're really excited to have Mike here with us today. We really appreciate his efforts on behalf of our industry, and we thank him for making himself available. At this point now, it's my pleasure to turn this over to Mike Judge.
All right, thanks, Mark. Today I'm going to try to cover a pretty broad overview of the program, go into a lot of detail as much as I can on a lot of different topics. The presentation I'm going to use is actually a presentation that we just posted yesterday. It's an updated PowerPoint that reflects all of the regulatory changes that were made, some of the specific details that we've just put out in guidelines that were posted yesterday, final guidelines. There's only one additional slide that I added, given the audience that we have today, just to highlight a few specific changes to the below 25 kilowatt application process that people may not be paying full attention to. So, but otherwise, this PowerPoint is available on DOER's website and the Solar Program Administrator's website. So quickly, just this presentation, as I mentioned, was developed for just general use by stakeholders. There's a lot of links here where you can find information on the program, links to the regulation, links to guidelines, clarifications on how the program is going to be enforced and executed, a link to the DPU docket where you can see all of the information that's been filed, including the intervenor briefs that were just filed earlier this week. So that proceeding is nearing a close. And then also links to sign up for updates, and then also contact links. So all this is available on our website. So before I get into the details of SMART, just want to clarify a few things on how the SREC II program is going to wind down. So the SREC II program remains in effect, and it will remain in effect until after the DPU issues an order approving the SMART tariffs. So the SMART program effective date is the date on which not the DPU issues an initial order, but that the compliance tariffs that come out of that order go into effect. So DOER and the distribution companies will be providing more guidance once we have more information on that around the exact transition date, but the SREC program continues to be in effect until that time. Projects with capacities less than or equal to 25 kilowatts that are interconnected before the SMART program effective date are eligible to qualify under the SREC II program. with an SREC factor of 0.8. That has not changed. That will continue to remain in effect. For projects larger than 25 kilowatts, the SREC factors just recently declined once more. There's no plans to decline those again after this. I think this should probably be the last step down. But you can see anything that is deemed mechanically complete after March 31st, 2018. And depending on the category you're in, those are the SREC factors on the far right side of that column. So I'm assuming most people have some basic knowledge of the SMART program, but just in case, I'm going to go through some of the basic details. So it is a 1,600 megawatt program as measured in alternating current. It's a declining block tariff incentive, so it's not an SREC market. It's not, there won't be any certificates being actively traded. All of that's going to transfer automatically to the utilities, and they will pay participants directly via a tariff that's being reviewed by the Department of Public Utilities right now. Everyone gets a base compensation rate based on the size of their system, but then those base compensation rates decline as capacity blocks are filled. The amount of the term of the tariff for a facility, it varies based on the size of the facility as well. So facilities less than 25 kilowatts have a 10-year term. Facilities greater than 25 kilowatts have a 20-year term. And then the compensation rate structures are differentiated between behind the meter and standalone facilities. And I'll get into the details of that a little later. So there's also 4 types of compensation rate adders that are available to eligible facilities. So these are location-based categories, off-taker-based, energy storage, and solar tracking. And I'll also get into those in a little bit. And then lastly, similar to the SREC programs, there's a maximum project size per parcel of land. In SREC, the capacity was measured in DC. In SMART, it's measured in AC. So the maximum project size in the SMART program is actually very comparable to the SREC program, but it's 5 megawatts AC per parcel of land. A few additional features: the initial compensation rates were established using the results of a competitive procurement and were announced earlier this year. Those compensation rates are based on the distribution company and specific capacity block, and I have another slide on that coming up. And then there's 2 components to this program. Every solar project receives compensation under SMART through an incentive payment and an energy compensation. So today, the 2 forms of energy compensation that exist are net metering, where it's available, and then also you can be a qualifying facility and be paid the avoided costs rate via the qualifying facility regulations and tariffs. And then additionally, under SMART, there's been a proposed other option to virtual net metering, which is called the Alternative OnBill Credit Mechanism. So each one of these energy compensation rates is established via a DPU tariff, net metering in the first case, QF in the second, and then the SMART tariff in the third. And all of them are in the province of the Department of Public Utilities. It's DPU approves these tariffs and is responsible for administering them. Well, the utilities are responsible for administering them, but under the DPU's oversight. And as I mentioned, the Alternative OnBill Credit is a new compensation mechanism designed to be an alternative to virtual net metering, and it's not proposed to be made available to facilities with on-site load. So only facilities that export 100% would be eligible for that, such as like a community solar facility. Like SREC II, the program design steers projects towards optimal locations by providing incentives for projects located in specific areas, such as rooftops, parking lots, landfills, brownfields. But in addition to that, there's a greenfield subtractor that we have that's applied to the base compensation rate of any facility that's sited on open space and doesn't meet some of the criteria to receive the full incentive. We have specific land use categories, which I'll also get into in a little bit. Then lastly, one thing I think a lot of people are very excited about is the energy storage component to the program. So energy storage that's co-located with solar under SMART will be compensated via what's a variable adder. So this isn't a fixed price, but based on the ratio of storage capacity to solar capacity, as well as how long that storage can operate. As far as the administrative aspects of the program go, it's very much a partnership between DOER, the distribution companies, but also there's the application review process and that management of that process, calculation of compensation rates, and then interacting with the public, being the face of the SMART program through a website and application portal. That is the solar program administrator's role. And in particular, Clear Result was announced as the solar program administrator in last fall, and they partnered with Clean Power Research. They're going to use PowerClerk application platform to intake applications. They do have a website with a lot of information on it, and we are actively working with them and the distribution companies to build the application so that it's ready when the program is expected to launch later this year. So before I get into some of the details of the mechanics of how some of these components work, I just wanted to clarify that there's a bunch of factors that determine how much a facility is going to receive under the SMART program. So one of the biggest determinants is the service territory that you're in. The incentives are differentiated by service territory and by capacity block. So if a utility is in block, if a specific utility is in block 1, the compensation is going to be different than if it's in block 2, and then it's also going to be different between each utility service territory. So those are two big determinants. The other one is the capacity of the facility, because that will determine the base compensation rate and where the project falls within that component. Whether or not it's eligible for compensation rate adders, that will also be a factor. The greenfield subtractor, as I mentioned before. And then lastly, the behind the meter versus standalone. It doesn't actually change the total amount that the facility is eligible for under the tariff, but it does change the mechanics of how the incentive payment is calculated and processed. So the capacity blocks, as I mentioned before, the program is a declining block tariff-based incentive program. And the way that it's set up is that each utility has blocks of capacity that are available at particular compensation rates. And then those compensation rates step down over time as more capacity is reserved. So the majority of the utilities, the 3 of the 5 distribution companies, have 8 capacity blocks. Fitchburg, Gas and Electric, and Nantucket, given their size, they were allowed to select fewer than 8 blocks. So Fitchburg selected 4, Nantucket selected 2. And each block has a minimum of 20% and a maximum of 35% capacity set aside for projects less than or equal to 25 kilowatts. So you don't have to worry about large projects coming in and wiping out a full capacity block if you're an installer operating in that kind of smaller residential, small commercial sector, because there is a carve out within each block for those specific types of projects. And then as each capacity block is filled, the compensation rates step down by a predictable 4% per block. The way that these base compensation rates were set for each service territory was through a competitive procurement. So we solicited 100 megawatts of projects, bids for 100 megawatts of projects back in November of 2017. Each distribution company solicited an amount proportional to the amount of load that they serve in the state, and those results were announced in January. In a few cases, we had to administratively set the price due to either no bids coming in or insufficient bids. But in Massachusetts Electric service territory under National Grid and Western Mass Electric under Eversource, we were able to set those rates through the competitive process. Each base compensation rate is set by service territory and project size. So this chart is a bit of a condensed version of our guideline version of this so that it could fit on one slide. But you can see for block 1, Fitchburg, Gas and Electric, and Mass Electric have the exact same base compensation rates. Nantucket and NSTAR have the same, and then Western Mass has slightly lower. And then also, I should note that the Fitchburg, Gas and Electric, and Nantucket, because they have fewer blocks, the decline between blocks is a little bit greater. So Fitchburg is an 8.8%, Nantucket is 16%. And more information on this, a lot more information on this can be found in the guideline that is provided in a link at the bottom of this slide. So I mentioned earlier the compensation rate adders. There's 4 different categories. Projects above 25 kilowatts can qualify for up to 1 adder from each category, so you can add them and stack them. but projects under 25 kilowatts can only qualify for the energy storage adder. So a lot more details on the eligibility criteria for these adders can be found in a bunch of the DOER guidelines that are referenced here. Those guidelines were just published. 4 of the 5 here were just, the final versions were just published yesterday. The only one that is still outstanding is the energy storage adder guideline, which we had a workshop on a couple of weeks ago, and we're still trying to finalize the parameters for that. That should be finalized soon, but the other ones are available. The values vary. These were established by DOER primarily through the results of a consultant report that we conducted before we promulgated the regulations to figure out the differential value and differential costs associated with building these types of projects. And like the capacity blocks or like the base compensation rates, these adder values decline 4% as the adder blocks or adder tranches are filled. So there's 80 megawatts available for each adder at these rates to start the program. But then after that, DOER is going to determine how big those block sizes are for each adder, sort of based on the how much uptake there is for each adder in the first month or 2 of the program. I think we'll be able to establish some benchmarks as to how fast these things are going to fill up and what the appropriate rate of decline should be. And again, more information is in our guideline on this. Land use is a big component, new component of this program. And so there's 3 categories of land use. The majority of projects are going to fall in category 1, and they will have no greenfield subtractor being applied to them. However, larger projects that are in open space may be subject to a subtractor if they're in category 2 or category 3 land. So the way that we calculate the adder is on a per kilowatt hour per acre impacted. So if you're impacting 30 acres, you're going to have a bigger subtractor than if you're impacting 5 acres. And that acre area impacted is determined by the square footage of the PV panel. So we look at how big each module is, and then how many modules there are, and then multiply those to figure out the actual square footage and then acreage impacted. The categories are determined based on a number of factors. So one of the primary ones on category 1 is whether or not it's located in land and agricultural use as defined in our regulation, how big the system is it ground mounted versus building mounted, what's the existing condition of the land, has it been previously developed, and then also some of the zoning criteria can come into play. So I'll probably skip over some of this, but category 1 land use is broken into 2 things, those that are on agricultural land and those that are not in agricultural land. So, but generally speaking, if you have a capacity of less than 500 kilowatts, or if you're building mounted, if you're on a brownfield, landfill, parking lot, you're sited on land that's been previously developed as defined by DOER, or you're sited on land that has a specific local zoning for solar, then these categories don't apply. Or category 1 would apply, and you would not have a greenfield subtractor. Category 2 is land that's been previously developed in a zone for commercial and industrial development. So this is a half of the subtractor, the full subtractor. So you're getting, 0.0005 cents per kilowatt hour per acre impacted reduction in your compensation rate. Category 3 is the full subtractor. So this is, again, only applicable to facilities that are larger than 500 kilowatts and less than or equal to 5 megawatts. And anything that is on land that has not been previously developed or has been previously developed but is not zoned commercial industrial, that's when this would apply. So one of the other really big important features of the program for people to understand is the difference in how incentive payments are calculated for standalone facilities versus behind the meter facilities. So for standalone facilities, these are facilities that have no associated on-site load other than parasitic or station loads. They're exporting everything to the grid. And this can be net metered, alternative on-bill, or non-net metered. That's the qualifying facility projects. The incentive varies over the life of the project and is equal to the total compensation that you're eligible for minus the value of energy. And I'll get into what that means in a second. Behind the meter is any facility that doesn't meet the definition of standalone. So if you're serving any on-site load, then you get classified as behind the meter. And in that case, the incentive payment is fixed for the duration of the tariff term and is determined at the time you're interconnected. So for standalone, the the way that the value of energy is calculated depends on the type of the facility. So if you're net metered, it's the value of the net metering credit. If you're alternative on-bill credit, it's the value of the bill credit as determined by the smart tariff, which is currently proposed at the basic service rate. And then if you're non-net metered, it's the value of the QF payments that you receive in that particular month. So here's an example of exactly how it works. It would be the incentive payment that you'd be eligible for is equal to the base compensation rate. So that's the rate that you get based on the size of the facility, any adders that you have, minus any subtractors, because that determines your total eligible rate under the program. And then if you multiply that by the kilowatt hours and then subtract out the value of energy, that's how you determine the incentive calculation. So on the example here, we have a canopy facility that's 500 kilowatts, it's net metered, it's receiving a 21.25 cent kilowatt hour all-in compensation rate. And the net metering credit is approximately 20 cents, but it's also receiving this adder. So the total compensation is always going to be 27,250, but the incentive is going to change as the net metering credit value changes. So in the first month here, it will be 27,250 minus the 20 cents of the net metering credit. That's the incentive payment. But if net metering goes down, then the incentive will go up. If net metering goes up, then the incentive will go down. But you'll always receive 27,250 in some form. So this shows how this might work over a 20-year term. So the blue is the energy value, kind of fluctuating and changing as prices change, and the red is the incentive. And you can see that over time, the incentive increases and decreases as a proportion, but the facility is always eligible to receive, in this case, about 28 cents. For behind the meter, it's a fixed price calculation. So we do a similar, we look at the value of energy in a similar manner. We're trying to figure out how much does each kilowatt hour, or approximate, how much does each kilowatt hour that you're offsetting, how much is that worth? So the way we do that is we take the current distribution rate, transmission rate, and transition rate, and then the 3-year average of the basic service rate. So these are all the components of a customer's utility bill, or the main components of a customer's utility bill that are volumetric in nature. Add those together and then subtract that from the total rate that they're eligible for under the program. So if you're, and these rates are based on the distribution company service territory and the rate class. Yesterday, we actually just put out a calculator for this. So you can go into that calculator, plug in what service territory you're in, what capacity block you're in, what the size of the project is, whether or not it qualifies for any adders, and that calculator will tell you exactly how much the facility is eligible to receive in that capacity block and in that service territory, and then what the value of energy is currently, and then what the incentive payment would be for the duration of the project. So this calculator should hopefully be very helpful for people trying to figure out exactly what the value is going to be to an end-use customer. The way that I describe these behind-the-meter facilities often is to say that the facility is receiving a almost like a fixed-price REC contract when it qualifies under this program, and then the incentive just rides on top of the energy price. So so just to give an example here, I'll jump into the next slide as well to kind of show you how this works and how it's different than the standalone. Again, we have a 500 kilowatt facility, National Grid Block 1. It's receiving 25.5 cents per kilowatt hour with a 2-cent building mounted adder, so it's receiving 27.5 cents, somewhat comparable to the last project. It's connected on a G1 rate class, so small commercial rate class. So the value of energy in this particular instance, let's say it's 18 cents per kilowatt hour. The incentive rate that is fixed for the duration of the 20-year tariff term here would be 27.5 cents per kilowatt hour, the total compensation rate it's eligible for, minus the 18 cents per kilowatt hour. So you'd be receiving 9.5 cents per kilowatt hour for 20 years, regardless of what happens to the electric rates in that time frame. So this shows how the incentive is a little different than standalone in that it's not capped. The total amount of avoided electricity costs and incentive payments that a facility can receive if it's behind the meter actually can go above the total compensation rate, because that incentive just rides on top of energy. If energy goes down, then the total compensation goes down. If energy goes up, then the total compensation goes up. But another thing to think about is how much export you have, because if you're exporting a lot of energy and you're behind the meter, that exported energy may be valued at a different rate than what you're actually avoiding behind the meter. So there's a lot of dynamics here, but if the facility is generally sized to meet the load and is not going to have a lot of export, then the behind the meter, there's a lot of value to be had by deciding to qualify as that type of facility. So a number of things that have been clarified in the last couple months as we've put out some of our draft guidelines and then our final guidelines yesterday is around the statement of qualification process. So I mentioned that Clear Result is going to be building this application for us. That application will be made available following the issuance of the DPU order, and DOER will announce that day that the SQA will be made available. I have a link here to sign up for programmatic email updates for those that are interested. And then the program is going to generally be first come, first serve. However, applications submitted in the first week or first 5 business days that the application portal is available are going to be reviewed and can be considered to have been received at the exact same time. And we will rank those projects in terms of priority into which block they get placed in. For projects above 25 kilowatts based on the executed interconnection service agreement date, and for below 25 kilowatts based on the executed contract date. So the earlier you contract with the customer, the earlier you get your interconnection agreement, that will determine the priority in which your application is reviewed and placed into the queue under the program. So another thing that people should be aware of is there's a non-refundable application fee to the solar program administrator that's still pending approval at the DPU. So that is a departure. Because there's this third-party entity doing it, the administrative costs associated with that program are now going to be recovered primarily through by the applicants submitting a one-time application fee, which is a flat rate regardless of system size. At least it's been proposed. So applicants need to meet the minimum application requirements. They may need to submit additional application attachments depending on the type of facility that you're applying for. Minor application deficiencies can result in that being returned with opportunities to fix it. So we have a whole process by which the application process will be managed that's outlined in our statement of qualification and reservation period guidelines. So we explain how the application process works, what documentation you need, what the back and forth is between the program administrator. And then we're also working with the program administrator and the distribution companies to develop application checklists so that people know exactly what materials they need to provide once the application is ready. So a couple things I wanted to highlight for this particular audience for 25 kilowatts and less are the application requirements, some of the high level ones. So for all facilities under 25 kilowatts, everyone needs to submit a copy of the executed contract with the installer, between the installer and the not necessarily the owner of the system, but the entity that you're working with. And also a customer disclosure form that DOER has provided. So the customer disclosure forms have been provided in draft form. We're working on finalizing those in the coming weeks. But you need to have copies of both that and the contract. If you're seeking a low income based compensation rate, which is the highest compensation rate under the program for low income residents that have a facility below 25 kilowatts, you need to demonstrate that the customer is actually a low income customer and is on the low income residential utility rate. So that would be verifying that they're an R2 rate class customer. If the project's third party owned, you also need to have an executed power purchase agreement or lease in addition to the contract. For constructing the system. Those might be one and the same in many cases. Lastly, all facilities, regardless of size, will qualify for an initial 12-month reservation period, but may be able to apply for an extension to that reservation period subject to the requirements of our guidelines. So there's a number of extensions that are available, but once you apply and are approved then that project has 12 months to be constructed, or it gets kicked out and goes to the back of the line. So one thing, this is the one slide I added for today, is just some important information for facilities that are 25 kilowatts and less under SMART. And just wanted to really highlight some key distinctions between how things work under the SREC program and how things work under the SMART program. So in terms of regulation requirements, one of the key requirements that DOER has placed on facilities below 25 kilowatts is that the installer of the facility is required to submit the application to DOER or to the solar program administrator on behalf of their client, because this is required to be in the turnkey service contract that they have with the customer. This is a requirement that was kind of borrowed from the Commonwealth Solar rebate programs that were in place, several years back. And this is because the reason that we have this is we do not want to have homeowners submitting these applications themselves, because they are not, generally speaking, they're not as informed, they're not as on top of this stuff, and we don't have a role of an SREC aggregator in this program. So you don't have that third party that's going to be providing that service. So really, the installer is the best person to be providing this information directly to the administrator. And as I mentioned before, that application needs to include the executed contract and the copy of DOER's customer disclosure form. Some other key things that I think people should be aware of, and I'm not sure how much everyone's following the tariff and some of the details, but these have been proposed in the SMART proceeding at the DPU. So these have not been approved by the DPU yet. But there's the application fee, which I believe has been proposed to be $80 per application. That's a flat rate. The distribution companies have also proposed that production meters be owned by them, because they're going to be billing customers directly and paying customers directly. They've asserted that they need to own the meters to actually have that data themselves to process the payments. And they've also proposed that the cost of those meters would be passed on to customers via a one-time charge to their electric bill. That's only for behind the meter systems, and it would show up on the customer's bill immediately after they interconnect the facility. So installers should be aware that if you're going to have a customer participating in SMART, the meter is no longer going to be something that you need to provide. It's going to be something that the distribution companies will either provide themselves or will provide specific guidance on exactly which meters you need to procure. So some of those details are still being worked out, but that is the general nature of the proposal. Lastly, from a cost recovery standpoint, this has probably not come into the conversation under the SREC programs, because the cost recovery for SRECs is built into the basic service rate, and any kilowatt hour that a customer avoids the entire cost of that. But under this program, cost recovery has been proposed to be a separate line item on the bill. So it's going to be pulled out and highlighted as a separate charge, and that all customers will be subject to, including customers that participate in the program. So the distribution companies have proposed that the nature of that charge be fixed, and it will be a fixed charge that all customers will see based on the rate class of the customer. The Attorney General, should have added Attorney General there, has proposed a non-bypassable volumetric charge. So again, a separate line item, but it would be structured in a volumetric charge, similar to the system benefit charges that exist on customer bills for the Renewable Energy Trust or energy efficiency. For facilities above 25 kilowatts, there's some minimum eligibility criteria that I think a lot of people that have worked in that space will be familiar with. So this is the fully executed interconnection service agreement, proof of site control, and then any non-ministerial permits that may be required. These are identical to the net metering requirements. They're identical to the SREC II requirements that used to be in place. There may be additional criteria as applicable, so it depends on if you have specific land use categorization that you need to demonstrate, that may apply. If there's things you need to provide to demonstrate eligibility for a compensation rate adder, those may apply. And then also, if you're subject to our product segmentation rules, evidence that that facility qualifies for an exception to the segmentation rules. And similar to the small projects that I mentioned before, projects qualify for initial 12-month reservation, but can apply for extensions. They can either pay a fee, there's an extension for legal challenges, and then there's extensions for good cause. The last step here is once you've submitted, you've received a reservation for 12 months, the last step is to actually enroll in the tariff once the facility is operational. So once you get an authorization to interconnect issued by the distribution company, you are eligible to enroll in the tariff. You have to provide that to the solar program administrator, so it's an update to your application. If you're a ground-mounted system, you need to provide a PE stamp certification that the performance standards in the regulation have been met. So there's more details on that in the guideline. And then you also need to satisfy all terms and conditions of the tariffs as proposed, as approved by the DPU. So those are still being finalized. But as one of the biggest things, for example, would be assigning the rights over to the distribution companies for the all of the ownership of all the renewable energy certificates. And then lastly, you can't make changes to the final as-built system capacity that exceed the original AC capacity. So you can't, the AC capacity is what you're locked in at. That's the maximum size that the project can be once you get a reservation. But we do allow de minimis changes, increases or decreases in the DC capacity, recognizing that sometimes equipment isn't available and there's some fluctuations there. This is just sort of high level for location-based adders, some of the things that you may need to provide. So for a building mounted, you really just need to provide a site plan just showing that the project is located on a roof. For floating solar, you need to get a predetermination letter from DOER because we have to consult with the Department of Environmental Protection on that. For brownfield, it's the same thing. That's a well-established process that we've had under SREC II. For landfills, you need to demonstrate that you have the permits from DEP, a post-closure use permit. Canopy, again, it's just a site plan. Agricultural, which is a dual use facility, you'll need to get a predetermination letter from DOER because we also consult with the Department of Agricultural Resources. Regarding the agricultural facilities, I highly recommend that people look at the guideline that we just put out yesterday, the final guideline on that, which provides a lot more flexibility through a waiver process to qualify for that particular adder. This adder allows for facilities that can demonstrate that there will be continued agricultural productivity on the land to qualify for a pretty significant adder. But there's also probably a fairly significant amount of engineering costs associated with constructing the system in a way that doesn't provide too much shading to the underlying land. For off-taker-based adders, this is actually pretty comparable to how the process works in the SREC II program. More or less, what you need to provide is, if it's community solar, a copy of the Schedule Z if it's net metered, a copy of the credit allocation form if it's an alternative on-bill credit, and then an executed disclosure form for each participant if it's community solar. Low-income property and public entity, you just really need the predetermination letter that it's low-income property or the credit allocation form. The storage adder I mentioned before, a variable adder, and it's based on the ratio of the storage capacity to the solar capacity, as well as how long that storage can operate. There's a base adder of 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour, but that's really just a component of a formula designed to provide higher values to higher capacity storage and longer duration storage. Similar to all the other adders, the value decreases 4% per block. And unlike other adders, though, facilities below 25 kilowatts can qualify for this. So this guideline is still being finalized with some of the specific operational parameters and how we define co-located and a few other aspects, but that should be done soon. But the formula itself can be a little daunting if you look at it at first. But I think a more useful thing is the outputs that result, because the reason the formula is designed to create these particular outputs. And what you see on this chart here is that as you have a longer duration battery, and as you have a higher percentage of storage capacity relative to the solar capacity, you see that the value of the adder increases as you move from left to right and top to bottom. But it increases at a faster rate in the 2 to 4 hour duration and in the 25 to maybe 60% capacity of solar. And so that's sort of the sweet spot, I think, if you're trying to maximize the value. It doesn't mean that you can't get more value out of it by continuing to have longer duration or larger batteries, but you start to get some economies of scale. And there's also, as noted in our energy storage study, sort of a diminishing return on the value provided to ratepayers of batteries that are those longer duration or larger size. There's some operational requirements and minimum and maximum requirements. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some just general parameters. They're meant to be fairly high level so that you allow for a wide range of use cases of energy storage without putting too onerous requirements on the actual facilities. But they're also designed to make sure that the battery isn't just sitting there doing nothing. We want to make sure that these batteries are cycling, that they actually are going to be providing benefits to the grid, that they're not purely being used for resilience, which is important, but is not necessarily the primary goal of including storage in the program. The last thing I just want to cover is an update on where the tariff proceeding is. So last September, the distribution companies filed a model tariff and accompanying testimony with the Department of Public Utilities. So that initiated the proceeding at the DPU. And the companies have explained in there that the filing is designed to track very closely to DOER's regulation requirements, but also contains some specific items highlighted for the DPU to review, which include the alternative on-bill credit and the specific details of that, how cost recovery works, the process for issuing payments to generators, some of the metering requirements, and then just some of the tariff enrollment requirements. So again, this is only a proposal at this time. No decisions have been made. And then more information can be found in the DPU's file room, and I have the link in the information on how to get there below. As far as schedule is concerned, we're pretty far along in this process. There's only a few more filings left, and the last filing is actually coming up next month on May 21st. Earlier this week, all of the intervening parties, of which I believe there were 6, filed their initial briefs outlining their argument to the DPU on what should be approved and what should not be approved and what modifications should be made. So DOER filed a brief, SIA filed a brief, Attorney General's Office, I think the Acadia Center, Boston Community Capital, AIM, and GenBright. So there's actually 7 parties that all filed briefs to the Department of Public Utilities. Utilities will be filing their initial brief in a couple, week and a half, and then there will be reply briefs. And then after that, there's no set timeline for the Department of Public Utilities to act, but we sort of anticipate that an order is likely to come out sometime in the summer. We are planning for an order to be issued in July, at least internally. That's how DOER and the distribution companies are making sure that all of their systems and processes are ready to go by July. But that initial order by the DPU will be an order approving the model tariff. And what it will say to the distribution companies is, this tariff is hopefully, presumably approved, but with these changes and conditions. And so they may make some modifications and direct the companies to refile a compliance tariff. And just gaming that out, let's say an order comes out July 15th, possibly the compliance tariffs are supposed to go into effect on August 15th. On July 15th, DOER and the distribution companies could announce that the program will be available in mid-August, and that's when the applications will start coming in. So we can't actually have anything in effect until those tariffs are fully in effect, but we would expect that to be a relatively short time frame between the model tariff and when the compliance tariffs are approved. So with that's the extent of my presentation. There's probably a lot more I can talk about, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions that have come in, so I'm happy to take those for the next 10 to 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. We really appreciate all of the information that you provided. This is extremely helpful, and we appreciate your guidance on the timing of implementation of SMART. A few housekeeping items for everyone that is on the webinar. First, we will be making this webinar and the Q&A available. We will be sending a link out to every participant who has registered for this webinar. We'll also include a link to DOER's site that has the presentation on it. As Mike said, there's a ton of great information on DOER's website, so we'll make sure we send out that link. We're going to jump into Q&A now because I know that's something that's particularly important for everyone that's participating today. Just a few things about that. There is a Q&A interface on Zoom. That's where you should be submitting your questions through. Maybe on the bottom or the side or the top of your screen, but just find that Q&A interface, and that's where you can enter your questions. I will be actually reading the questions, and then Mike will be responding. We have about 15 minutes, but we'll get as many of these questions in as possible, which means I should stop talking and start asking questions. There will also be a webinar follow-up that BlueWave will be sponsoring. It'll be specific for BlueWave, just to follow up on this webinar and the questions that were asked. So stay tuned. We'll provide you with more information from that. So with that, I'll start with the first question that we have. Does SMART make a customer choose between a roof-mounted versus carport solar PV system on the same parcel of land? There are many situations where both are completely viable options to install. Schools, hospitals, C&I, shopping centers, any building with a parking lot that has solar access. Mike?
Yep. So yeah, I can take that one. So the SMART program, there wasn't as much information on here as maybe we should have. We might want to add a slide or two. But the SMART program has a single parcel rules, somewhat similar to the net metering rules. And the purpose of that rule is to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of the higher incentives that are available to smaller capacity systems by breaking up a large system into lots of small ones. So taking a 2 megawatt facility and say 500 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts, and then they all qualify for a higher compensation rate. So that being said, I think we recognize some of the challenges that the DPU has faced implementing the single parcel rule, and we've created a whole bunch of exceptions to the rule. And just a couple of them I can give a flavor to would be if you have a building mounted project and a canopy on the same parcel, that's eligible. They would be treated as separate projects, but they can be located on the same parcel. So that, I think, answers this specific question, but there's other examples too. For example, a building with multiple tenants. If you can demonstrate that the interconnection on that property is behind different customer meters, then you can have multiple projects on a single roof, which is not allowed today under the single parcel rule for net metering. So the DPU has an open docket on the single parcel rule and exceptions. They haven't issued an order on that, so there may be some changes to the net metering rules, but in SMART, there are exceptions, and the particular example in the question would be allowed.
Great, thanks, Mike. And before I ask the next question, one thing that I failed to mention is whatever questions we're not able to get to today, DOER has graciously agreed to take those questions and respond in writing, and we'll make sure we get those responses out as well. The next question is related to on-bill crediting. How is on-bill crediting going to work? Will it be included in the DPU ruling? If no on-bill crediting, how will SMART incentive be paid?
So the on-bill credit is completely distinct and separate from the incentive. And so it's really a credit for energy, and just to draw that distinction. And the incentive is anything additive to that. The way that it has been proposed to work is very similar to virtual net metering, with credits being transferred from a remote facility to an off-taker. The credit value is established, at least proposed to be established, at the basic service rate. And you can cross ISO New England load zones, unlike net metering. The one big distinction, which has been a point of contention among some of the parties, is there's a proposed limit on the number of credits that can be transferred. So the distribution companies have proposed limiting the amount of credit transfers that can occur at based on the usage of the customer receiving the credits. And that would have the effect of being able to eliminate a customer's energy supply portion of their bill, but not necessarily the delivery charge portion of their bill. So this is a point of contention. I don't know where it's going to end up at the DPU in the final order, but the alternative on-bill credit is squarely in the review of the Department of Public Utilities right now, and that's a pretty active discussion between all the briefs that are being filed. But it is separate and distinct from the actual incentive payments, which a facility would be eligible for. Even if the alternative on-bill credit isn't approved, you can be net metered or you can be a qualifying facility.
Great. The next is a two-part question. Does a system need to reach PTO before smart transition or just register? And the second part of that is when does the developer apply for smart tariff, before or after final interconnection?
Okay, so for the first one, I'm assuming that's an eligibility for SREC question. If it's below 25 kilowatts, the facility needs to have received its permission to operate before the smart tariff is in effect. So, you know, as we get closer to the likely transition date, sometime in the, you know, August timeframe likely, or September, I'm hesitant to provide a firm date because we don't know exactly when. But as we get closer to that, one of the pieces of advice I'd have for installers would be to make sure that you're informing your customers that it could be an either or option. And now that you have some of the tools available to you to estimate what the actual incentives will look like under SMART, you should be able to give them kind of a fair estimate of what the difference in compensation will be under SREC versus SMART. And you know, if they're in danger of getting their PTO after an expected SMART transition date, that's something that they should be aware of. If you're above 25 kilowatts, the requirement is that you need to be fully constructed before. So you may be waiting on the interconnection to be officially approved by the distribution company. But if you're constructed on the customer side of the meter, then that's eligible to qualify under SREC II. For SMART, I'd strongly recommend submitting an application as soon as you have a signed contract and you can meet all of the eligibility criteria, because that will reserve the customer a place in the current capacity block. And it's expected that, you know, if you were to wait until a customer is actually operating, you run the risk that they're going to get a much lower compensation rate because they'll be in a later capacity block. So people should apply up front.
Great. Thanks. The next question is related to under 25 kW. What happens after year 10 at the under 25 kW program? And the second part to that is there no Schedule Z for behind the meter systems?
So after 10 years, the facility, I would presume that the facility is going to get all of its RECs back from the distribution company, right? So that facility would be eligible to enroll as a Class 1 facility under the RPS and generate RECs and sell them on their own. There are aggregators out there that do that. And then if they're net metered, which in many cases below 25 kW, not in all, because I recognize that there's not all 25 kW and below systems are eligible for net metering, but all 10 kW and below are, and many below 25 are, then it would still be eligible for net metering. So it would continue to generate continue to net meter and be eligible to generate Class 1 RECs on a going forward basis that they would own and be able to sell themselves. But there would be no continued tariff term. And then there's, as far as Schedule Z for behind the meter systems, there is a Schedule Z if you're net metered, but the Schedule Z may only indicate that you are not allocating the credits to anyone other than the customer. But so it really, if you're net metered, then yes. If you're not net metered, then no.
Great, thanks. The next question is, how does net metering impact the incentive price for behind the meter systems?
So it doesn't impact it. Well, I guess it's the value of the energy that's established for those behind the meter systems is based on the retail components of the bill. So if the customer has a 20-cent per kilowatt hour volumetric rate between its delivery charges and the energy and the basic service charge, then that's approximately what's going to be deducted from the total compensation rate to calculate the incentive. So let's say the total compensation is 30 cents per kilowatt hour, and then the energy value of energy that's determined is 20 cents per kilowatt hour. The difference between that is the 10 cents. That's what the customer is going to get in an incentive payment. But that doesn't mean that that's all they're going to get. They're still going to avoid electricity costs at 20 cents a kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour that they consume behind the meter. And I would recognize that, you know, facilities that have lower net metering credit rates or qualifying facilities that export to the grid, that would mean that they're not necessarily getting the full value of energy that is being assumed in the formula and the regulation. But I think that just kind of highlights that if you have significant amounts of export and you have a lower credit value that you're exporting at, that you should consider maybe being a standalone system, or consider ways to keep more of those kilowatt hours actually behind the customer's meter to avoid those higher electricity costs at the full retail rate. Hopefully that helped answer that.
Thanks, Mike. And then next question is, what happens with municipal electric companies?
So municipal electric companies are not eligible under the SMART program. They're regulated in a different way than the investor-owned electric utilities. And one of the kind of key components and principles of this program is that if you're going to be able to participate in it, you need to pay into it. And so municipal light plants are not going to be paying into this program, so their customers will not have access to this program. In the SREC program, the customers do not pay into it, but they do have access. So you have a bit of a cross subsidy between those customers. And so in this program, you know, the municipal light districts did not have an interest in having a regulatory framework and requirements placed on them. We are working with them to develop a program, but any program that we develop would likely be sort of limited in nature. And it would not be kind of to the scale of the SREC programs that we've had. That being said, they are free to design their own programs. They have a lot of flexibility to create their own incentive programs if they wanted to. And DOER would be happy to help them in that development of those programs if they have questions on how to implement things or how to create their own own program design that works for their particular community. But they will not be eligible under the SMART program.
Great, thanks, Mike. And it is, we're at around 11 a.m. Mike has graciously indicated that he's willing to take a few more questions. So we're going to take 3 more questions and then we'll wrap up. So thank you for that, Mike. The next question is, are SMART incentives transferable to new homeowners?
That's a good question. I don't think I've been asked that before. Yes, they should be. I think it will be. I don't know that we've figured out exactly what that transfer process will look like, but I assume it will be done through the distribution company, where you know, the customer coming in that sets up the new customer that takes over the service. The utility would probably inform them, hey, you're eligible to receive incentive payments, and would hopefully just be able to start processing those immediately. So I think it should, there's no reason that it shouldn't be relatively seamless. But that's a good question. That's not something that we've specifically thought of, because I think it's sort of post-implementation. How do we've been focused on getting the system up and running and not kind of what's going to happen once it is, but that's a good question.
Great. The next is it possible to change capacity blocks if you are approved under one and then capacity opens in an earlier block?
That wouldn't be possible, because once you're in a particular capacity block, you're in that block. And once a capacity block has been filled, capacity doesn't open back up in that block. If a project reserves capacity in block 1 and never gets constructed, and then by the time that it falls out, we're in block 3, the capacity that that project had previously reserved will just be added on to the end of block 3. So the capacity in block 1 doesn't open back up again. The only time where you might be able to move between blocks is when you've initially submitted an application and maybe you're the first person in block 2 and the person in block 1 in front of you, their application is deemed incomplete and rejected. You might be able to jump in at that point. But once the last amount of capacity in a particular block has been reserved by a qualified project, that block is closed permanently.
Great. And our final question related to storage is no retroactive storage adder for storage connected before SMART begins.
It depends. I mean, if the solar facility was an SREC facility that got a permission to operate and actually qualified under SRECs, then no, because that facility is an SREC facility and can't be eligible under SMART. But if the facility never registered for SRECs and never was operating under the SREC program, then it could be eligible as long as it was installed after January 1st, 2018, because that's the commercial operation date cutoff for facilities in the SMART program. So if a facility today is operating but has never registered for SREC II, then it can be eligible under the SMART program once the program launches, but that would be on a prospective basis. So we wouldn't be able to give back credit because the metered data wouldn't have met the metering standards in the tariff, presumably. So, but you could go qualify on a going forward basis.
Great. So that will conclude the Q&A portion of the webinar. Mike, I just want to say on behalf of BlueWave, our installer partners, our other business partners, and other individuals that are on the phone, thank you so much for taking time out of what is indeed a very busy schedule these days to go through the SMART program and to provide answers to a number of questions. We really do appreciate it. So thank you so much for that. A few housekeeping items. Oh, and one other thing that I want to say is we really do appreciate that DOER has been very actively engaged across the board, interacting with a number of us in the solar industry, and we're appreciative of how engaged you have been and DOER has been in developing the SMART program. So thank you in a larger sense on behalf of the solar industry for your efforts.
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. This has been a really, it's a good opportunity to talk to the public, so.
Great. So we have a partner support slide that's up right now, and so if you have any questions, follow-up questions from this webinar, if you didn't get a chance to post questions online, please contact our partner support line or email us at the partner support email address below. Everything that has been asked today, as I mentioned, via the webinar, will get responded to. DOER will respond, and of course, we will make sure that we get those responses out to you. I also just want to mention that today's recording, we intend to get that link out to you later on today. With that, again, I want to thank everyone who's participated. We've had over close to 100 participants in today's webinar, which is fantastic. And so, as has always been the case, BlueWave, it's very important for us that we facilitate these kinds of discussions and get as much information out as possible. So it's Friday. Everybody enjoy the rest of today and the weekend. And again, thank you very much, Mike, for being with us today.